the subject of our talk today, which is the world becoming a better place? Developments in international law, which Professor Kuttab will now modify to more directly address the situation with Jerusalem at the moment. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you especially to Professor Jonathan Kuttab for coming, sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. And thank you to Robert Massoud and Karen Rodman for effecting the introduction to Professor Kuttab for us. International law can be a very polarizing topic. It's very easy for people to either, on the one hand, romanticize international law as a panacea to all violence and injustice, or on the other hand, to simply dismiss international law as nothing but a fig leaf over exercises of raw power. And so we are so happy to have Professor Kuttab here today to discuss international law and the condition of the world with us from a perspective of someone who has really been deeply, intimately on the ground involved in struggles of using the law to forward projects of justice. I'll just say a few quick words, an introduction of his bio, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Kuttab. Jonathan Kuttab is a Palestinian attorney and human rights activist from East Jerusalem. He graduated from University of Virginia Law School and is licensed to practice in New York, Israel, and Palestine. Jonathan has co-founded a number of human rights and civil society organizations, including Al-Haq, which is the first human rights organization in Palestine, the Mandela Institute for Palestinian Prisoners, the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence in Jerusalem, and Operation Smile. He is also the co-founder of Nonviolence International in Washington, D.C. And we know we've used many of Nonviolence International's materials in our own resources on nonviolence and for cultural center. Jonathan serves on the boards of Bethlehem Bible College and Sabil, a Palestinian Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem. He was a member of the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement of 1994. He has written and published extensively on legal aspects of the Israeli military occupation of Palestine. He is currently a visiting scholar at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, which is why he happens to be in Toronto, and so we have the gift of having him with us today. We know he's been doing very extensive speaking across Ontario during his time with us, and so we are so happy that he has carved out some time to be with us here tonight. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Kuttab.
Thank you very much. Actually, you may think that in light of recent events, the last few days, the fact that I am a Palestinian who seems to be living in a part of the world where there is an exception for Palestinians from what is happening elsewhere, that it is very bold for me to talk about international law and about the world becoming a better place with anything but bitterness and disappointment. But I do not. I take the opposite point of view. And one reason that allows me to take the opposite point of view is that I take a longer historical perspective. An interesting book which I would urge all of you to read, even though I would disagree with many of their conclusions, is by Yuval Hariri, where it's called Homo Deus, where he talks about the future, the changes that the human race is going through. In the introduction, he says, and I think he's quite right, that for most of its existence, humanity suffered under direct, imminent threat to its existence from three sources. famine, plague, and war. He gives many examples how, as late as 1.5 centuries ago, every community on earth was on the edge of starvation, where one flood or 1 year of drought or 1 year when the armies, whether they are yours or somebody else's, goes through your district and eats up everything. Whole families, whole towns, whole villages would literally starve to death. This is no longer the case. This is absolutely no longer the case today for the vast majority of human beings. Yes, there is some significant malnutrition. Yes, there are some areas where once in a while famine strikes and international assistance is a little bit slow, or the armies prevent food and foodstuffs from reaching particular areas or villages. But for the majority of human beings today, more people die from overeating than from starvation. It's no longer a bane of human existence. And plagues used to decimate entire cities, entire communities, entire areas, where 10%, 30%, or 50% of an entire city or country would be decimated by a plague or a pestilence. And these plagues were very frequent. They would come and go very frequently. Today, thanks to modern science, but also thanks to international organizations worldwide, we now have massive vaccinations. We now have systems of delivery of health services. We now have laboratories and manufacturers of medicine, so that even if a whole new disease comes up, like SARS or Ebola or the avian flu, yes, a few hundred, a few thousand, maybe a few 10,000 people worldwide are killed before it's pretty much brought under control. And finally, war. This is hard for me to say, but today, after the last 2 world wars, a new international system was created, where for most of the human race, war is no longer an immediate threat. There are certain parts of the world, and Palestine is in one of them, where still war, occupation, conquest, civil strife kills and bedevils the lives of many. But for most of the countries of the world, there is not only an absence of war, but there is also a situation where war is not even thinkable. People don't even plan for what would happen between France and Germany, or Norway and Poland, or most of Latin American countries. Even peace now is a real part of the world. Yes, there are still rogue elements and rogue states. Yes, there are small bands of people here and there who actually have more noise, more bark than bite. But for most of humanity, we hope it stays that way. War, massive war in which millions of people kill each other, may well be a thing of the past. Now, why did this happen? This didn't just happen overnight. One part of the reason why this has happened is because international law has taken root. Because after 2 world wars, a lot of people, a lot of civil society, a lot of politicians, hard-nosed thinking politicians, decided this cannot be the state of humanity anymore. We must put into place rules and procedures that govern how people conduct their affairs across national borders. Now, this was not easy because there are always powerful people who don't want to be ruled by law. The 5 so-called permanent members of the Security Council even managed to write into the law a special exception called veto power. And to understand what that means, you have to know that when the United Nations system was created, people really thought that we are close to making war itself illegal. That we are slowly moving towards a world where human affairs are conducted on a different basis. Well, there will always be rogue elements, and for them you have a Security Council composed of 15 members, 5 of them permanent and 10 that keep rotating and changing. And the Security Council will be the only body that legitimately is authorized to use force. And these 5 permanent members said, well, you know what? We want to have the veto power, that the Security Council can only act under Chapter 7, can only impose sanctions if all 5 of us agree. Any one of us can use veto power, and that resolution asking for actual teeth, actual sanctions, actual use of force, if we veto it, it doesn't happen. That was a mistake, of course, and we still, Palestinians, I say, more than anybody else, continue to live with the burden of that veto power, which has been used against us time and time again, even when the entire world community pretty much agreed that we were being aggrieved and that the state of Israel deserved to be sanctioned. Nonetheless, despite the existence of veto power, despite the fact that international law, which was progressing very rapidly in the last half of the past century, has been slowed down, and there are even attempts to reverse some of its advances, which I'll talk about in a minute. But by and large, we live in a world today where there are a number of new principles that have come into play. One of them is the existence and the acceptance of universal human rights. It started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, December 10, which was unanimously approved by the General Assembly. and which has sort of become accepted throughout the world as a standard, today, 2017, I can say fully and completely that every single country in the world, every significant organization in the world, every ideology, every political party, every thinking person accepts, at least in theory, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being, just by virtue of the fact that that human being is a Homo sapien, deserves certain rights. This sounds to us today like basic. Everybody knows that. But you have to remember, just 100 years ago, even in the most progressive countries in the world, women didn't even have the vote. Half the human race didn't have the right to vote. It was totally acceptable that you would denigrate people because of their race, because of their color, because of their gender, because of their religion, because of their age, if they're children, if they're women. It was acceptable that those others had no rights. It was perfectly acceptable that you would kill, imprison, enslave, deport, totally discriminate against them. Now, I know discrimination does continue to exist, don't get me wrong. But as a principle, as a law, today, human rights are part of the international legal system and part of the intellectual system acceptable by one and all. Secondly, international law used to have a principle called sovereign immunity. Lack of interference in internal affairs. International law used to only apply to behavior between and across international boundaries. How different countries interact together. It used to be none of anybody's business what I do inside my borders, because I'm a sovereign country. What I do inside my borders to my own population was nobody's business, except mine. And anybody who tries to talk about it or interfere in it, this was called interference in the internal affairs of other people. Today, that no longer applies. Today, it is well known and well accepted that if a particular ruler or regime or country commits grave violations of international law, carries out massacres, carries out genocide, carries out severe violations of human rights, then it's everybody's business. And everybody is entitled to call for, interfere, to demand an end to that behavior. Fourthly, the role of civil society today is greater than ever before. This is really important for you to remember because, again, international law used to be built on states. There were sovereign states that related to one another. But international law developed only because ordinary people worked very hard, lobbied their own politicians and their own countries, organized themselves into organizations, whether it's Amnesty International or different legal organizations for human rights, or whether it's Doctors Without Borders, whether it's whatever the particular organization is. It is now part of the role of individuals to interfere, to pressure, and to bring about changes, and to demand that their own countries do more to bring about changes. This movement culminated in the creation of the International Criminal Courts. Let me talk a little bit about that. Because towards the end of the last century, it became clear that the United States in particular was not very happy to see international law develop. You can bring war criminals and those who commit crimes against humanity before a special tribunal like the one that was created to punish the Nazis for their war crimes and the Japanese for their war crimes. And every once in a while you'd have a special tribunal like for Rwanda or some other particular conflict. And usually you would go after countries which have been defeated. And then you bring their leaders to trial in a special tribunal made for them. The International Criminal Court was a huge step forward. And when it was first proposed, about 63 countries supported it, and 7 countries rejected it, including the United States, including Israel, including India, including Saudi Arabia, and 2 or 3 others. However, despite that, enough countries signed on that there is now an international criminal court that exists. It has its own secretariat, it has its own prisons, and it has its own mechanism for investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, we know that its jurisdiction is very limited because it's complementary jurisdiction, which means it only takes jurisdiction after you have exhausted other remedies and after you have tried other courts. But this was a major improvement in international law that we cannot ignore, that I think continues, albeit a little slowly, the march forward. There are 2 new possible negative developments in international law. They have not taken place yet, but we ought to be alert to them. The first is an attempt by the United States to redefine the laws of engagement when it comes to what's called asymmetrical warfare. They are saying when a large country like the United States is fighting a group like Al-Qaeda or other terrorists, we can't have the same rules apply. You must allow us a little more freedom to go after those nasty guys, even if it means we'll end up killing a lot of civilians. This is a very dangerous new doctrine that the United States is promoting. And I think we have to be aware of it, and we have to say, no, the rules are the rules. You cannot relax the rules just because you are powerful and strong and you have drones that have a lot of destructive power, and you're moving against a less developed enemy. The second one is another doctrine that Israel has used in the past before and the United States now wants to use, which is called preemptive self-defense. Preemptive self-defense. What does that mean? International law recognizes that every country has the right of self-defense. Preemptive self-defense says, if I think you're about to hit me, or if I think you're a bad guy who is organizing yourself to maybe attack me, then under the principle of self-defense, I can go and attack you first and start a war. And that would be legitimate under international law because I am preemptively acting in self-defense. It's a very dangerous doctrine because it removes the basis of international warfare, which says that you can only use violence in self-defense, and that you should go to the United Nations first, to the Security Council, before you carry out any military action against somebody else. Okay. I will stop here with my international law analysis and come to a problem that many of you probably are thinking about right now. What has happened the last 2 or 3 days? And what does it mean? What happened and what does it mean? What's happened is that President Donald Trump decided, for whatever reason he chose, to simply ignore international law, to ignore 70 years of basically an international consensus, to go against the advice of all his advisors, including 9 out of the 11 previous ambassadors to Israel, U.S. ambassadors to Israel. And you know, those people are not great internationalists. Those people are chosen for that position because they are basically hand-selected to be acceptable to Israel and to be friendly to Israel. 9 out of 11 of them says, don't do it, don't do it, you are playing with fire, you are acting against international law. Basically, there are at least 2, probably 3 arguments under international law why that recognition should not be made. The first argument is that UN Security Council resolution, unanimous, number 181, the partition resolution, which basically allowed for the creation of the State of Israel, recognized that Jerusalem itself and its environs are a corpus separatum, are a separate entity. Because Jerusalem is so important to all 3 major monotheistic religions, you can't have any religion claim exclusive control over it. It should be international or have a unique international status. They even selected Count Bernadotte, a Swedish person, to be the governor of the Jerusalem area. He was assassinated by the Zionist groups before the state was created, and nothing was done to set up the corpus separatum. But enough of the countries of the world realized how sensitive this issue is that they decided they'd better hold their embassies in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem. The second reason legally why this issue was relevant is because since 1967, when Israel captured the rest of Jerusalem as well as all of the West Bank, the UN Security Council unanimously, no veto this time, repeatedly said these are occupied territories. These are not part of the State of Israel. You are not allowed to annex any of them, including East Jerusalem, into the State of Israel. The entire fabric of international law will collapse if we start allowing states to capture and annex small parts of their neighbors, no matter what the excuse. Even if it's Iraq recapturing the 19th province, which is called Kuwait, that was totally unacceptable. These states have to be recognized. You cannot annex them. So when Israel announced that it annexed East Jerusalem, the UN Security Council says this is null and void, we do not accept it. And when in 1980 it openly passed a new basic law, which is like a constitution, saying this is part of the State of Israel, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, about 12 countries which still had some kind of embassies in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, immediately moved them out, moved them to Tel Aviv. Because it was a clear declaration, people felt, that Israel was violating international law, Israel was ignoring the feelings of Muslims and Christians worldwide, Israel was basically acting in an anachronistic way. Let me explain this word, anachronistic. In when I speak to Zionist audiences, I tell them Israel's biggest problem is anachronism. It's acting as if it is living in a different century than the modern times. Israel is acting the way the world was 2 or 3 centuries ago, when colonialism was acceptable, when ethnic cleansing was normal, when occupying and annexing other people's land was acceptable, when collective punishment was what everybody did. Today, you can no longer do this. Israel has the military power. It has the capacity to do what it wants. The problem is the entire international community, the entire international system is built on a different basis today. You cannot do everything you want. Many Israelis are living in a big bubble. They think that as long as the United States is willing to support them, they can in fact ignore international law. And they have been ignoring international law. There is an accepted conventional wisdom in Israel that they have some kind of deal or some kind of commitment from the United States to always use the veto power whenever Israel needs for them to use it. Barack Obama shocked them, literally shocked them, by actually abstaining once. The last month in office, he abstained on a resolution against Israeli settlements, which was a simple resolution. It was not even a binding resolution. But the fact that he abstained instead of vetoing it and allowed it to pass 14 votes to 1 abstention shocked the Israelis, because it sent a message to them that this umbrella that protects us from international law may be removed at some future point. The biggest problem with the law of Jerusalem is not that it asserts that Jews have rights in East Jerusalem. Of course they do, historical and other, and religious. The problem is that it claims exclusivity for Judaism over the city of Jerusalem. And this is something that the rest of the world cannot and does not accept. As a Christian, I am pleased that there are no more Christian claims to exclusive control over Jerusalem. We did that during the Crusades. We went there and said, this is important to us. This is where our Lord and Savior died, was buried, and was resurrected, and we have to purge this holy city from all the infidels, who at that time were Muslims and Jews. And so the Crusaders, in the name of Christianity and in the name of God, fought and killed and pillaged and destroyed, including destroying other Christians who weren't of the same sect. Most of the Palestinian, the original Arab Christians, suffered under the Crusades. Thank God there are no more Christian claims to exclusivity in Jerusalem. There are Muslim claims in Jerusalem, and some of them claim it exclusively. I've heard some Muslim scholars say not only Jerusalem, but all of Palestine is a Muslim waqf. It's a very dangerous doctrine. Very dangerous doctrine. But when the state of Israel claims this is only for the Jews, this is exclusively under our sovereignty, the Muslim world not only does not accept this, but is also very angered. We may see some demonstrations and some acts of violence in the short term. I suspect they will not be as great as people are afraid of. I am not worried about that. I am more worried about the long-term effects. Because every moderate Arab regime now is under threat from extremist Islamic forces. And there's nothing that feeds that narrative more than the actions of Mr. Trump and than the actions of the State of Israel. I don't know if any of you remember a couple of months ago when the State of Israel tried to change the status at Haram al-Sharif and tried to set up these metal detectors and the inspections and stop people from coming in. There was an immediate reaction from Palestinians in Jerusalem, Christians and Muslims, by the way, and I am thrilled that the action was non-violent. They decided to hold a pray-in all of Jerusalem, but not in the temple area of Haram Sharif. The entire city, all the streets in it, were filled with people worshiping and saying, we will continue to worship in the street until you remove those metal detectors. It was these people and not any kind of outside pressure that led the Israeli government to retract. I am worried when people introduce a religious element in the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. Because religion, which can be a very positive force, can also be a very negative force. Because a true believer of any religion believes that he is doing God's will. And if you're doing what God wants you to do, all other arguments fall by the wayside. The fact that you are few against many is irrelevant. The fact that you are weak against the powerful is irrelevant. The fact that you are less armed than the other side is totally irrelevant. The fact that your actions may in fact hurt is irrelevant. Because if you're obeying God, what more do you want? What more do you want? I am worried. I am worried about the consequences of this action. Not in the short term, but in the long term. My time is almost up, but before I open it for questions, I want to repeat very quickly what has been a central theme in my speech. Humanity is moving forward. History is moving forward. We are becoming a better world and a better species. The fact that there are certain areas where that improvement is not yet seen is regrettable, but it is not inevitable. The fact that the Arab world and the Muslim world, let us face it, is still behind is again regrettable, but not inevitable. The Heritage Foundation, a right-wing group in the United States, has a very good process for tracking down authoritarian regimes and democracies. And it has found in the last 3 or 4 decades that there's been a great shift towards more democracy. More and more authoritarian regimes have fallen and given way to democratic rule. There are still about 27, 29 countries in the world today which are not democratic. And most of them, unfortunately, are in the Arab and Muslim world. But that is neither inevitable nor is it certain. Change can and will come. And change will come when ordinary people, civil society, rise up and act. We have seen during the Arab Spring the beginnings of that movement, which was quickly aborted. And one of the ways that the regimes aborted it was by putting themselves in contrast to Islamic fanaticism and chaos. Every Arab leader said, whether it was Bashar al-Assad, or whether it was Hosni Mubarak, or whatever regime you mentioned, every regime said, me or chaos, me or ISIS, me or Islamic extremism. I am here to tell you these are not the only 2 options available. There is the option of freedom, of democracy, of human rights, of respect for every individual, of a new and better life for all our people. Thank you.